Welcome back to Making Therapy Better with Dr. Bruce Wampold, the podcast where we give voice to the researchers, clinicians, and clients who are all working to understand what makes therapy work and how can we make it work better. In this episode, Bruce sits down with Dr. Louis Castonguay from Pennsylvania State University to explore the evolution and current state of psychotherapist training and education. Regardless of whether a therapist is providing cognitive behavioral therapy or really any other theoretical orientation, Dr. Castonguay argues that more attention should be given to training therapists in process-level skills that can really help them think deeply about each client's suffering and their role in the client's change process. Rather than training therapists to adhere to theoretical assumptions or treatment manuals, effective psychotherapists should be highly trained in foundational trans-theoretical skills like case formulation, treatment planning, and effective use of supervision. Dr. Castonguay was awarded the Lifetime Contribution Award by the Society for Psychotherapy Research and is the author of numerous books, including How and Why Are Some Therapists Better Than Others? Understanding Therapist Effects, which is a really great book. Highly recommend it if you have not read it. Your host, Dr. Bruce Wampold, is one of the most prominent psychotherapy researchers alive today and has co-authored the hugely influential books on this topic, including The Great Psychotherapy Debate and the newest edition of Persuasion and Healing. Today's podcast is brought to you by CarePaths EHR, a practice management and electronic health record system with integrated measurement-based care, telehealth, and HIPAA-compatible AI-assisted progress notes. Research shows that therapists can get better outcomes today through measurement-based care, and with CarePaths, that's never been easier. Head over to carepaths.com now to learn more about how we can help you to make your therapy better. And with that, let's tune in for this very engaging conversation between Bruce and Louis. And please let us know what you think. Drop a comment in our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? What has your experience been about all of this? And please like, comment, subscribe, share. We really hope we can count on you to help us grow this channel and this conversation so we can all work together to make therapy better.
So Louis, it's great to talk to you today. I'm really looking forward to it. We were talking a little bit beforehand about how long we've known each other and how long we've tolerated and enjoyed each other over the years. And, you know, when I look at the field and I think about who really reflects on psychotherapy at a deep, deep level, you come to mind because you've thought about it in so many different ways, and you have this intellectual background that makes it really important to talk about these issues in this way. So I'm really looking forward to today.
Well,
So, you know, in preparation for this, I reviewed again your work, and the span of understanding what happens in psychotherapy is so broad. So you have training in CBT, but you've also written and have training in integrative therapies. You've written one of the landmark studies on common factors, and then also the common strategies. So what's common at the strategy level? So we're going to talk about each of those in some detail. But let's start with CBT. You know, I always am taken because I was driving my car and ended up at the grocery store listening to NPR. And Alex Spiegel was doing a report on social anxiety and treatment. And I think she's long retired, but a very good journalist and reporter. But what she said is that cognitive behavioral therapy is the fastest growing and most rigorously studied form of psychotherapy. So I agree with that. But then she said, which I think is the interesting part. She said, "It is fast becoming what people in America mean when they say they're getting therapy." So that was 20 years ago. So what's your reflection on that, Louis, and CBT in today's world of psychotherapy services?
Well, it's a great question. I agree with what you agree with her, what she was saying. And what I would say about the statement that you made about this is now what Americans think about therapy. I would say she's right on when you're thinking about graduate students. If you ask undergraduate students in most of the school in America, and most likely, I would assume in North America, who they are exposed to, they will say in the world of psychotherapy, they will say CBT. And when they arrive in graduate school, unless they have had some kind of experience in terms of research experience or clinical experience in between undergrad and graduate, my experience, based on what I see at Penn State, is that the graduate students, when they think about now psychotherapy, they actually do think about CBT. Whether this or not is made its way to the general populations, I think that if you were to ask people in their 20s and 30s if the way that Woody Allen would picture
Yeah.
psychotherapy, like in his movies with Manhattan and other, does that fit? They would probably say no, even people who live in New York. And they would probably their parents would probably still think, well, this is the way to go.
Mm,
Still reading the
mm,
New York Times article that referred to the couch and but I think a larger number of individuals, especially the more younger generations, uh, have been, kind of more in contact with problem-solving type of orientations, behaviorally change, focus, and I think that the CBT has played a more prominent role than the other orientations about this. So definitely, I would say, Bruce, one of the things that I'm noticing when I'm teaching uh, and again, this is about the U.S. This might be different in Quebec,
mm,
where I come from, and also different in different parts of Europe, and certainly Latin America. That people have not read Freud. When they read Freud, they read it they didn't read the text. They
mm,
read it from an undergraduate book where they talk about the fear of castration, the penis envy, the anal stage. And also they have not read Rogers. They think that he's very, very simple, that it's really simple to be empathic. And although they have not read Beck, I mean, that's also kind of an issue. People don't read the classics anymore, which is very dangerous, I think. But certainly they have been more exposed to Beck, and they are presented as, unfortunately, as not only the most robust in terms of empirical evidence, there's more study that have been conducted, but very frequently what people would say is that what they are exposed to is that especially Freud is not falsifiable, right? It's not, you can't test his view. And then when you actually say to them, well, no, it is operationalizable. It has been done. And by the way, there's quite a bit of evidence, not only in terms of the treatment, but in terms of the construct that Freud
mm.
talked about, whether it's defense mechanism, whether it's transference, whether it's building a rapport. So I think, to me, I'm not so, I'm okay with the fact that CBT is viewed as a prominent orientation. I'm more worried about people disregarding the contributions, including the conceptual, clinical, and empirical contributions of non-CBT orientations, because it should not be an all or none. And it should be like, let's increase our repertoire of skills and repertoire of understanding to address the complexity of human behavior.
Mhm. Well, so much to unpack there, Louis. Um, let's start at the basic level, which is your observation. And you train psychologists,
Yeah.
and you're familiar with training across the United States and other places as well. But most clinical psychologists are being trained in CBT. Is that a fair observation?
That would be my impressions. I would though put a kind of a caveat, right? I would say in the US or in North America, but especially in the US, you really have, in some ways, four ways of getting trained, right? So there's two types of institutions: that the university base, and there's the private base, and then the PhD and the PsyD. So it's a 2x2.
Mhm.
Certainly in the PhD given in university, which tend to be viewed as the most prestigious. It's very difficult to get into the program every year. We just finished the selections of we just finished our interview weekend, and all the colleagues are saying, I would not have got in this year. They're so good. Those in the PhD that are provided at the university, what students are presented with is CBT more than anything else. And part of the reason why, right, Bruce, that is, many of the therapists who have been funded, many of the therapists who are conducted empirical research, comes from a CBT orientation. So there's a kind of like a synergy that is taking place there. That world, I would say yes. Now, whether or not CBT has as much of a predominance in the three other cells we talked about, I'm not too sure. I would assume that there are PsyD program in
Mhm.
private schools where people are exposed to systemic approach, or psychodynamic approach. But I would be thinking that in all of these type of program, that unless the school defines itself as a Adlerian or psychoanalytic, I recently gave a talk at the International Psychoanalytic University in Berlin. Well, the CBT will not be represented there, but
Yeah.
everybody kind of knows. But other than having a school label themselves as we are a specific orientation, I think it would be fair to say that a CBT would be represent there as you got to know that you got to know that.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about one of the forces here, and that is, CBT was the predominant approach that was funded by the NIMH for research. So then, of course, in academic psychology departments, you need to be funded, or at least there's strong pressure to be funded. And the way to do that is to study CBT uh, uh, predominantly.
And that
I don't,
becomes a cycle. The graduate students that you will take will be people who will do the type of research, and they will do the research, etc. It's just maintained itself, which is, for a while, I remember, luminaries, people like Les Greenberg, who would say, I'm accused of promoting an orientation that has no empirical basis. And when I'm submitting grants, they're telling me there's not enough empirical funding, right?
yeah, yeah.
So it's
And,
this cycle.
and Drew Weston as well. He was quite articulate about the fact that he couldn't get funding to study psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approaches because the NIH told him we already have treatments.
Right.
Why would we need to spend money showing that other treatments work as well?
Right. And this is one, of course, as you know, this is one of the negative consequences of putting all our eggs in one basket when we think about research in terms like randomized clinical trials conduct in controlled environment that are funded by the NIMH. If that's the only type of research that we're going to be conducting because it's funded, then that cycle will just repeat itself, right? So we need to find other methodology to be able to say, well, you know, there's evidence that actually support other form of treatment.
Mhm. Well, we're going to get that. I have it in my notes that we're going
Yes.
to talk about research paradigms other than clinical trials. So let's again talk about the clinical or training in clinical psychology being predominantly CBT. What gets left out when we do that? I mean, I want to talk about there's certain advantages
Yeah.
to training in CBT, but let's talk first about what gets left out.
Oh my God, we could open up several bottles of wine and just talk about that for days, right there. So many sad consequences of this. Again, I mentioned earlier is that it's limiting the repertoire of interventions of the therapists that we're training, whether they're going to mostly doing research or mostly doing practice. So they do not when they are in an environment where they should be receiving expert, systematic, intense training, you know, they're not receiving it because it is very difficult to have and institutions, like for example, we demark ourselves at Penn State because we say to the graduate students, hey, you're gonna have some experts in CBT who are doing research and who are practicing CBT, but you also have psychodynamic researchers and clinicians that are not adjunct faculty, they are in the program. And I think that's difficult. So one of the things that people from a purely personal perspective for the therapist is say, well, you know that if you're going to be you will want to be exposed if at some point you think you're going to want to be exposed to other form of therapy than CBT, you're going to have to do that outside of your PhD program. That's very sad in a way.
Mhm.
We're not feeling one of the function. And as you know, right, there's quite a bit of evidence, so much so that we stopped doing research about that because this research was done in the 50s, 60s, and later on, that the clinicians, you know, when they are out there with experience, they don't limit themselves to the things they have learned during grad school. They will actually kind of they broaden their expertise, and they will go get some training. So I mean, it is, in my view, the issue I would say is there is no evidence whatsoever that would say that one school should be the only one we teach. And there is not one single piece of evidence that shows that we should stop teaching psychodynamic and we should stop teaching humanistic and we should stop teaching systematic approach. If people were to read about the empirical literature, including the books that you have behind you in the Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change, you would have to say, if we are an empirically based program, we have to train people how to conduct emotion-focused therapy, how to conduct systemic therapy, how to conduct short-term psychodynamic therapy, not only for the process research, but for the outcome research. So that's something that is big that people are losing.
Yeah.
I also have to tell you from a more social perspective, I'm worried that the psychotherapy is very relevant now, I think, for the world. And the two places that we are receiving a lot of attention is CBT approaches. I should reformulate that. Mental health training or mental health delivery is receiving a lot of attentions now, and it should. But we are approaching it more and more within the scope of two traditions or two paradigms, the CBT paradigm and the biological paradigms. And these two paradigms have a lot of things to say. They allow us to understand some of the determinants of the behavior and some of what maintains some of the clinical problem. But there are two things that we're losing that is so obvious to me. When you look at what's going on in the world right now, the conflict between voice, some of the voice that are coming, right? There's an article in the New York Times now today about the far right coming out in a place where it was supposed to be never again. To think that Freud has no relevance to this, it's foolish.
Yeah.
It's like people forgot, right, that Freud is responsible in large part for the Manhattan Project, because when Einstein was asked whether or not he should participate in that project, right, he didn't. He was a Pacific, and he was saying, well, who should I ask? Well, there was only one person in the 30s that he considered as his level, which was Freud, a German-speaking and a Jewish guy. So Einstein sent him a note and said, should I or should I not participate in this project to build a nuclear bomb? And Freud said, and you can see those letters, by the way, Freud says, you have no choice. This is going to happen, and it's going to be either into a more benign civilizations or one that is full of darkness. This what led Einstein to go there. We're getting a little bit close to kind of a sense of all or none, scapegoating people,
Yeah.
the way we treat each other. To think that Freud is not relevant to understand these darknesses is foolish. And here's the other thing. We live in a society where all the emphasis is on this, right? This is like, right? What we're missing, right? Or the brain, the fMRI. What we're missing is an existential perspective. The fact of the matter is, Jean-Paul Sartre was right. We are condemned to be free. We have no choice but having a choice. That would not solve the issues. The fMRI will not explain, how I'm going to cope with how much time I spend in relationship with people, in my work. When will I retire? Should I have kids or not? Those are not determined by neurons, right? Or the amygdala. And so that's the problem, major problem that I have. By focusing so much on CBT, I think that psychology is missing an opportunity of being very relevant for the world by saying, look, we have some paradigm for which we have conceptual traditions and empirical information. You should pay attention to that. This should not be coming only from literature or sociology. This psychology have to play a role about that. And we're putting all our eggs in the same basket, and that's very sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Louis, that's a very inspirational way to approach the question. And that's why I asked to talk to you, because it isn't just about psychotherapy, isn't just about learning how to think more adaptively to the world or to worry a little bit less. I mean, there are legitimate things we should be worried about. I mean, I'm waking up in the middle of the night worrying about the state of our country. And those are things that are important objects for us to think about in psychology. And when we reduce kind of our being to dysfunctional thoughts or rumination or worry, we forget that we're humans in a very complex world.
So there's something that is happening in the United States that firsthand, and that people are not alarmed to it. And I keep wanting to write a paper with my colleague Jeff Hayes about this. So for a very, very long time, there have been a very important traditions of counseling psychology, very strong. And actually, my first master's was in counseling psychology. That's where I learned integrative approaches. And now, as you know, Bruce, there's many very, very famous counseling psychology program that have closed. Stanford, Penn State. The problem with this, right, these Ph.D. programs that were very, very solid, is that they were the one who were carrying Rogers' message. They were carrying the existential and the humanistic message. We had a place, we had a traditions where we could say, okay, all right, we can still relate, to rely on Barry Farber, who's at Columbia and Teachers College, and other people. There's still great counseling program, Maryland and Missouri, but the point here is I'm really worried that the humanistic orientation and the existential perspective will actually not receiving or being promoted from a scholarship point of view. That's really scary to me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's there's a hegemony that is drowning out other approaches. I mean, just from a very practical level, we know from RCTs, dropout rates, cognitive behavior therapy, is relatively high. And this is ideal setting. Well, if a patient doesn't respond to CBT, we have to think about other approaches. And we know preference is a good predictor of outcome. Well, many people don't prefer CBT.
Oh yeah, I mean that's my point is again the issue is having a repertoire of interventions or knowing about the field. I think there are some people who are very comfortable to kind of say, look, this is what I'm good at, this is what I want to do. But the people that I really do respect will also say, yeah, but there's some clients who prefer a more insight-oriented perspective, and I have very good colleagues and friends to whom I can refer them to. Well, what's the
Mhm.
problem with that, right? That's
Yeah.
that's the way it should actually. Unfortunately, they should be some kind of, especially considering the empirical evidence, they should be more representative of the psychodynamic and humanistic orientations within the Department of Psychology that are PhD program. That there should be. I think that's a big major problem.
Are you in therapy and not sure if it's working? The Making Therapy Better app lets you easily measure how you're doing over time. Mental health research shows that tracking your progress and discussing it with your therapist leads to better results. So download the Making Therapy Better app today. It's absolutely free and takes less than 5 minutes per week. Results are easily shared with your therapist so you can both be sure that you're on the right track. It's time to make your therapy better.
Interesting. I want to come back to your statement about the students you're admitting into the PhD program, because you made the observation, well, many of us wouldn't have been admitted if
Yeah.
we were now applying. But the criteria that we use to admit students to these programs is problematic, don't you think? They're very academic indicators of success.
Yeah.
So the focus is on kind of the research orientation. And again, we're an American institution. We have this scientist practitioner or a clinical scientist now, even more so, which emphasizes these kind of academic. And we know that that's not necessarily related to the interpersonal skills that are necessary to be a therapist. So, I mean, how many programs use Tim Anderson's facilitative interpersonal skill to assess potential? for being a therapist.
Oh, it's very rare. Now this is a very personal question for me because my job, what the dean really likes, other than if I were to bring grants, which I don't, would be like the placement. How many people did you place in academia? There's also a kind of a personal issue is when I place somebody in academia, that means that I will have more contact with them because I'm going to see them at conferences. But so when we make the spiels and we say, what is the criteria that we are actually going to be using to who we're going to make an offer, I say to them, well, I'm going to be honest, is like, who do I think is the person who has the most chance to change the field? And to me, the best way to change the field that I know of, or that I can mentor people in that pathway, is academia. So there's a part of me that feels, yeah, I mean, that's the way it is because that's what I abided to. That's my job. But indeed, I never thought about the issue of that comes with one. I never thought about it because, to tell you the truth, even though I say to people, I'm choosing you because I think, right? I mean, essentially the goal of my career for the last 20 years is I want to train people who are better than me. So, and that means publish more, have, better statistical skills, better methodological skills, et cetera, et cetera. If somebody decides to go on a different route, I'm not worried because at Penn State, they receive a very good, solid training, a clinical. So I would say, Bruce, my concern would be what you're talking about. In places where they say academia is the way to go, and this is why we're choosing people. And if at some point during the program you decide this is not your life, you're not a second-class citizen. That's not a problem, right? There were some problems when I did my Ph.D., right, at Stony Brook. In my first class, I barely spoke English. The faculty member was talking about that there was 3 ways of accumulating knowledge. One was by relying on authority, like the Bible or Freud. The other was relying on their feelings or phenomenology. And the third one, the only valid one, was by observation and logical deductions, was basically logical positivism. And I raised my hand with a very strong French Canadian accent, and I this is epistemologically naive. The guy took me as a fantastic person, took me outside the class at the end, and he said, Louis, you look like a smart student. That was his words. But I'm worried about you because you see, there's 2 types of psychologists: psychologists who like ideas and psychologists who do not like ideas. And people who like ideas go in academia, and people who do not like ideas go in private practice. And I think you're going to go the other way. Stony Brook, you could feel that. You could feel in the 90s, like, well, if you're not going to academia, you're a loser. You're a second-class citizen.
Mhm.
That is the problem. If you're going to be academically oriented and type 1 orientations, that's the only thing you're going to be trained, and you're going to see the pathway of your utilizations of half of your students as being not worthy of mentioning, then you combine 2 problems. That is very dangerous.
Mhm.
That's very dangerous.
Yeah. We're going to get to that in some more detail, but you're painting a picture that is complex because if I'm a a person who wants to become a therapist, an effective psychotherapist, where do I go
Oh,
for training?
I have a very clear answer to that.
Good.
A very clear one. Somebody comes in and said, I respect science. I like to hear your studies, but what I want to do is I want to be a clinician. So I want to be prepared, but I don't want to spend 10 years being prepared. What should I do, Dr. C? They can't pronounce my last name, so I said Dr. C. So it's pretty clear to me. Social work is the way to go. The beauty of social work is you can go to, right? It's very, very tough to get to Wisconsin, right? In clinical psychology. So tough to get to Iowa State. So tough to get to Stony Brook, to get to Yale, to get to Penn State. But you can get into Berkeley and social work. They're taking a very, very, very large number, right? So when undergraduate students tells me, well, my uncles and my aunt will think it's not very prestigious for me to be a social worker, and I tell them that you could go to do a PhD at Penn State or to do a master thesis at Berkeley and see what's the most prestigious to your uncle and aunt that do not know too much academia, right? And then, by the way, if you get really interested in science while you're there, you can do a PhD in social work, but you don't need the PhD to become licensed.
Mhm.
So it's the best deal. You go there, plus you never have the second-class citizen. There is no difference between a PsyD and a PhD in social work. 2 years, you could put, you have your license, you practice, right? And as you know, if somebody knows it, it's you. The background, the professional background, not only does not explain, whether or not it does not predict whether or not clients will have an outcome, but as your research show, it's also not predicting who are not explaining why some therapists are better than others.
Yeah.
Right. So there is no empirical evidence to say you should not be trained in in social work if you want to be a mental health provider.
Yeah.
There's no evidence for this.
Well, Lou, I'd broaden that a little bit to say licensed professional counseling programs,
Absolutely.
PsyD programs. However, I supervise in various roles a lot of therapists and many therapists who are in their training or at the first stages of their practice. And I have to say that I am concerned about the quality of therapy that they're providing.
Hmm.
And I don't know if it was better generations ago, but we know there's a great variation in outcomes therapy depending on the therapist. Therapist makes a difference.
Yeah.
So, what are the implications for our discussion for how we train therapists? And I say this because, whenever I write a chapter or a paper and you're a reviewer, the comment I know I'm going to get back is, what are the implications for training? And you've said this to me maybe 6 or 7 times. How should ideally, how should we train therapists so they're effective therapists?
I remember this is a very long time ago. This was during the 80s. I was doing my master thesis. And there was this professor, Marc-André Bouchard at the University of Montreal. And we were talking about, because in Quebec at the time, you just needed your master thesis in order to become a psychologist. And he had a PhD. And then my view was, at the time, very naive, of course, was that, well, that's good, because if you want to do research, you do a PhD. If you want to do practice, you go to do a master, you go. And I remember him saying, well, I learned way more about therapy during my PhD program. The reason is because I was longer in this learning environment. And there were a lot of people who were there, and there was an open discussions. And I did some externship here, an externship there. And this was expected. So I think there is one issue, Bruce, that I think we need to be talking about, which is the longevity of it. I mean, that's my only concern with social worker, is maybe it's short, maybe it's short in a sense like that, not providing a lot of time because it's a big factor to learn different model, to develop competence in different model, working with different clinical population, and having time to process it, right? So, as you know, one of the variables, you talk eloquently about this, that explain why some therapists are better than the other, is the issue of when people are confronted with difficult issues, they spend more time thinking about it. They get additional training. That it's unclear exactly what the issue of humility and the issue of deliberative practice, but clearly you make a very strong argument in your chapter in the last editions of the handbook of that effective therapists spend time to think about what's happening. And I think when you have the advantage of a PhD, in a way, is you have longer time and more opportunity to get more training. So that's my fear. Let's come back to your questions. My fear is that whether our intention is very good, right? So we want to address the treatment gap. Caston makes a great argument that if we just maintain what we do of training very, very few people for many, many years, we're not going to address it. I'm afraid that the good intentions of, okay, let's train people to the minimum competence. And by this, I'm not pejorative. They need that, and then they train so that we are cost effective, that it may turns around that actually we're cutting corners.
But Lou,
Accepting too many people, we're not supervising them correctly. I'm worried about that.
yeah, I'm worried too. But it's not just the time part of it. The way we train therapists and the way we supervise therapists really is not an efficient way to learn the skills that are necessary to be an effective
And in
therapist.
fact, I would actually say, I know you have a take on this, right? That we have to have a different modality of training, and Tim Anderson is one model of it, which I know you have a take on this, which is a valid one. I have another one, but it's complementary. But maybe you're gonna say, "Oh, Louis, you're totally paranoid." So I think that the major problem now in the field, I don't have data about this. It's just talking to colleagues. So I think that a major problem, and maybe I should just say that to you in an informal context over drinking wine, but here's what I think, really. One of the major problems that we have now is that a lot of the therapists are being trained by treatment manuals. Okay. That's not the problem. The big problem is that most of them now are being trained to do that by people who were trained by treatment manuals. And that at some level, people are not realizing that those treatment manuals are an operationalizations. They are an independent variables, right? That Beck came in with, that Wiseman came in with, that Strupp came in because they were doing a study. NIMH required treatment manual. They came up with a treatment manual, and then they published it, right? So that was the beginning of it, right? And then after that, there was all sorts of series. But that started, right? Cognitive behavior therapy for depression, 1979. Most people don't know that this is not a clinical book. This is an empirical book. That's a treatment manual, right? The book by Strupp and Binder, right? A short key, or the key of, whatever the title was, such a great book. That was a treatment manual. The problem is if you are training people to just apply that, and you also don't have them to read the textbook that led to these treatment manuals so that they can understand the issues about conceptualization of psychopathology and then case formulations of the case, and then treatment plan within an orientations. I don't have a, when I look at people in my generations, when I went to Stony Brook, Stony Brook was the temple of cognitive behavior therapy. I have no problem with the people who were trained there because they read Goldfried, they read Bandura, they read Beck in the books, they read Mahoney before we had treatment manuals. I love the treatment manuals. I love them. I look at them and then I say, oh, yeah. Oh, this is very creative. Oh, yeah. But I also know that I can, the timing, what Freud referred to, tact and timing before you do an interpretation, that's not in your treatment manual, at least the one that I'm reading. So that's the issue. I think we need to figure out a way to ask people to have a conceptual understanding of what they're doing so that they're just not applying a series of techniques about this. And I think that might be, if we just limit ourselves to treatment manual, extends to what Tim is doing. If we just limit ourselves to that, I think that you do not necessarily provide the best conditions of dealing with the problem of being rigid and flexible. You are intervening. There's quite a bit of evidence that says that one of the problem is when people, well, there is some evidence in psychodynamic and CBT that say the problem is not the intervention prescribed in the treatment manual. They're not detrimental. It's when they are implemented in a rigid way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Louis, we should go on for hours, but I think you're really bringing up the important point. I mean, Tim Beck was effective. He was trained in psychoanalysis. He was a therapist, but so many people learn CBT without the idea that you're also a caring, understanding, and conceptually complex thinker about the case as a therapist.
I would actually say that I'm going to say something very nasty now about my former and current advisor, Marv Goldfried. Marv was trained Marv is one of the major figure for behavior therapy. And then he is one of the few that created cognitive behavior therapy with Beck, Meichenbaum, Mahoney, and of course, Ellis. And so his major book, right, in 76 with Davidson, Clinical Behavior Therapy, he was talking about the importance of the therapeutic relationship. He talked about the importance of insight. And what he did not know is that he was writing in 76 for behavior therapists who were trained in the 70s or in the 60s. Most of them had been trained knowing Rogers, seeing the tapes of Gloria, having received some psychodynamic training. So they did not need an extensive reminder of issues such as defense mechanism, they're going to pop up. Resistance, that's going to pop up. Whether you want to call it transference or interpersonal schema, whatever you want to call them, that will pop up. And by the way, the best way of knowing about that is not about reading in a CBT, it's to go to the other tradition that spent a lot of time. So unfortunately, I think that Marv did not anticipate that his book, which is now a classic, it's a must-read, was a book of his time, assuming that people kind of knew that stuff and we needed to remind them. Now, this book is so relevant, but there's been a gap of knowledge because people have not been trained about why is it important, right? Why is it so crucial to spend several sessions, 5 or 6 sessions, where you don't intervene much, right? So that you can if we take Sullivan perspective, you can see what's the interpersonal profile of the clients and how the client's going to pull you in. Is the client actually a more submissive person? Will want you to be dominant? Is it the reverse? Is it a person who actually is hostile and domineering and wants to control the issue? So I keep saying to my graduate students, the biggest mistake that I do, I was originally trained as a Rogerian. Then I always loved reading Freud, but then when I went to Stony Brook, I became a CBT. But the biggest mistake, that's not the only one, but the biggest mistake that I have done as a CBT is I intervened too fast.
Mm. Mm.
My case formulations, 2 sessions is done. My treatment plan is done. I think that the generations of the CBT in the 70s would still find time to see, as Marv would say, therapy is a microscope of the interpersonal life of people. Let's spend a couple of sessions. I keep saying to my students, I actually should spend just more time asking people about their life. Tell me about your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll decrease the panic attack. We'll go there. But I want to know more about your life. Right? So I think absolutely. I think we miss the fact that these giants, in part because they also wanted to demark themselves, right? So it was very important for Beck to say, well, psychoanalysis rejected me, therefore I'm going to reject you. And as Marv would also say, you don't get famous by citing others, right? You kind of come up with your own stuff. But I think that this generation just took for granted that what was, of course, if you're going to be a therapist, whether you're a psychiatrist or a clinical psychology, of course you're going to be trained in a psychodynamic orientation. And of course, you're going to be trained from a Rogerian and existential perspective. But you need more now. So
Right. But when you talk about this, I mean, it's an immersion, a real understanding of these approaches. It's not like we have a theories course and you read for 1 or 2 weeks about existential therapy and Carl Rogers. There's important, I mean, sometimes I do workshops. I play videos of Carl Rogers because the complexity of his conceptualization of empathy is so wonderful.
Yeah.
And he can talk for 45, 50 minutes. You can look him up on YouTube because people want to see YouTube rather than read this. But the complexity of it is
the complexity of it and the relevance of it. So, I thought Wednesday, 5 graduate students, first year, brilliant. And all most of them CBT oriented. And then, we're finishing up the tape of Gloria. And we spent
with Carl Rogers.
Carl Rogers. We spent 20 minutes, right, about the statement, right, that he makes. You look like a good daughter to me. To me, this was so stimulating. So we're 6 people, 5 graduate students, a faculty member, talking for 20 minutes about this, Of course, we talked the issue, well, he was doing that in 1965. This could be perceived as being, of course, very sexist and paternalistic, but also to kind of raise the questions that were raised by the students, like, has he crossed a boundary here? He doesn't really know her. What if, she just talked about her father. One of the students say, what if the father was more than just neglected? What if the father had actually abused her? Because she has a big issues about older men. And I was salivating because I was thinking, yes, when you actually have these giant and you read the text, because that's what they have been doing, like, for the last 3 weeks, we've been reading, his book, 1950 Client-Centered Therapy, right? So they're reading him in the text, and we are addressing issue about suicidality, and then issues about transference, and issues about that countertransference. And we're talking about it from a very serious issue about, and then I was looking at the students and I was thinking, you're raising a point I never really thought about it, which is, it felt like she took it, but yeah, this was actually not only bold, but that might have been dangerous. I never thought about this. This only came because with these people who have 192 of IQ are finally in a room where they do more than just reading an abstract from GCCP, right? And they're actually reading the text and they seeing the person, and then they're thinking about it. And then they're kind of rising some points like, oh my God, I never thought about this. Whoa, right? So that's the relevance. We're coming back to the issue of the training. It is the relevance of being exposed and having a place to reflect about this, right? We need to reflect about this. This is complicated, right? And so, and it was very interesting because then I said, to the graduates, well, you want to see some, they were saying like, oh my God, he's not treating, or, he's treating her in a paternalistic way. Well, you want to see something like that? Here's Pearls working with Gloria.
Yeah.
Are you a little girl? Are you a little girl? Are you a little girl? Right?
So
kind of like, this is fascinating.
So Louis, because we've covered a lot of ground, we're going to run out of time. We didn't get to a lot of things I wanted to discuss with you, but this is so interesting. But I do want to comment that CBT, the manual, really taught me how to structure therapy, how to focus on the problem, how to help the patient understand what we're going to do in therapy is going to be helpful. Goes back to Jerome Frank, by the way, this understanding of the rationale. He called it the myth, but also what the rituals are. So CBT, I think, brilliantly taught us many important aspects of what we should do in therapy. But as you say, if you just take it as a manual, it's not psychotherapy anymore. It's kind of you might as well read a self-help book.
Absolutely.
Go through it.
And I bet you that most people who would actually look at my tape of session, they would say, no, you're not a CBT. And I would say, yes, I am. What's my principle? My principle is I'm starting with, I don't believe in the disease model. This is my principle. Unless it's bipolar, unless it's psychosis, I don't believe in the disease model, right? And that's the point of...
But even in those examples, the humanistic part is absolutely critical.
Oh,
so
critical.
Yeah.
Right? When you understand, right, that a bipolar, somebody who has bipolar, between the acute episode, they are reacted with more frustrations when their goal is not actually achieved than people who don't have bipolar. When you realize that one graveyard shift, right, one not sleeping, one in bipolar will actually increase, the probability of having a manic episode, that is not addressed by your lithium. Right? And this is not addressed by, this needs to be taught. This needs an existential perspective. It's like, okay, here's the fact, right, that you are a human person. Now I'm telling you, you have to be realistic about your projects, because when you're going to hit the wall, when you're going to have frustrations, you're going to be more frustrated than I will, just because you have that disease. But the fact of the matter is, you still, as what Jean-Paul Sartre would say, you still have to build a project. The difference between me and my cats are better at anything, but I make a project. I actually have a kind of like, this is where I'm going. The person who has bipolar still has to come up with a project, but to have to deal with the reality, right? To have to deal, Bruce, with the reality, there are things that I cannot do.
Yeah.
If you think that the only way to deal with that is to see that as an irrational thought,
Yeah.
I got news for you.
Okay, Louis, go back because we're going to run out of time. Go back. If someone watched your tape,
Yeah, I mean, what they would say, they would probably more say that, I'm very kind of more Algerian, and that I'm probably slow, and I'm probably, I could be more on task. And what I would say to them, no, I'm driving is essentially by two things, right? Which is I think it is very important for me, and I remember having big fights about that with my psychodynamic colleagues. Distress to me is really important. Somebody that shows up in my office with 4 panic attacks a day or very high level of suicidality, I'm saying, shit, there's a problem. And that's a problem. That's not a manifestations of a character, right? That is a problem. And I want to decrease distress. And that CBT gives me the tools for this. The second thing is I believe in a non-disease model. Therefore, I believe that life sucks. Life sucks. And that what we have to do is to develop coping skills to be able to kind of address them. That orientation is providing me with the best tools for this. Now, those things do not come in a vacuum. They are things that people get distressed about. Some of them can be explained from a classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but some not. And some people have difficulty of solving problems, in part because they are facing problem in zones of life that is not a meaningful zone of life for them, right?
Yeah.
How many times, Bruce, have you been working with somebody who comes in very, very depressed? And you work with them from an individual perspective, whether it's psychodynamically oriented, whether it's humanistic or CBT. And you help the person to have a better understanding of their past. You have the person identify what their goals. You have the person to identify, oh my God, I really blame myself. And then at some point you just realize, you know what? You're going back to that marriage after every sessions.
Yeah.
And at some point, there's so much that I can do now in the room with you up until we address the issue of, do you want this? Do you want this marriage? What's the cost and what's the benefit of this marriage? I have not met any people in my life who said, great, this morning, it's fantastic. I'm getting a divorce. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, isn't that fantastic? Right. So let me approach this. First step, I will do this. Second step, I'm going to do this. Right. So that to me brings back the issue of an existential perspective. That's a choice. Right. But I have the skills and I can help the persons to make the skills to kind of like be more assertive in a relationship, work about the difference between intention and impact. Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's important. What about the choice?
Yeah.
What about that relationship, right? And that's in a way is I feel like that's not inconsistent with CBT, but that's not prominent enough about life choice and about the impact of the past. It's not prominent enough in the content. I think that if the CBT were to say, look, here's amazing skills, fantastic skills, but here are the content that because your treatment manual emphasize some independent variable as opposed to others, there's some content that you will talk less about. We have plenty of evidence, right? That in psychodynamic therapy, they talk more about the past than in the CBT. You're going to tell me that the patients And psychodynamic therapists have a more complex past than the people in CBT? Of
Yeah.
course not.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that if we were, and we could go back in some ways, we could go back to Mike Mahoney in 1973, who said, the best thing about CBT, those my words, is provide us tools to actualize the goal of humanistic therapy. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
That is brilliant.
I've got to go back and look at that, Louis, because that's so insightful.
Right. It's kind of like, give you tools to actualize.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So to kind of, I look at Rogers working with Gloria, and at some point I'm just saying, oh, come on, Carl, push. Yes, Gloria, you can sleep with the guys. That's fine. It's not a problem. Right?
Hey, Louis, we're running out of time. We got to about 1 or 2 items on my list, but this is just so inspiring to hear you talk about therapy from this rich context. And it really throws out this idea of CBT versus psychodynamic versus humanistic. I mean, we're really talking about integration, are we not? And
Oh, totally.
and I was going to ask you about integration, but you've talked about it throughout our conversation. So I want the audience to remember we had a discussion about how to really do integrative therapy, because that's exactly the discussion we had. And the way you passionately talked about.
Well, thank you. And I think, my guidance for the field of training would be this: have people receiving very, very competent training in at the minimum the 3 major orientation. Mike Constantino would say 2 is enough. I would say 3 major. Then at some point in your career, identify to one of them. Just identify, and then jump in, and then read the textbook, read the research, go and get training, work with that model to problems that are not supposed to be appropriate for that model. And then really develop, right, an expertise and integrate it at a personal level, intellectual, and interpersonal level. Then go practice with this model, and then pay attention to what are things that are happening in the room or outside the room that your model is not addressing. And then go back to the 2 others that you have received your competence, and you drop for a while. But then, put that back within your own integrations of whether it's CBT, right? So now go back to Freud and say, okay, that issue of resistance and defense mechanism, how will I integrate that? And that's feasible, right? Let's remember, right, that Skinner loved Freud. And one of the things that he actually loved the most is the defense mechanisms. There's a beautiful American psychologist paper that says, looking for Skinner, finding Freud.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Or the other way around. But the point here is that Skinner loved defense mechanism. And there's a clear reason for this. Think about it. The defense mechanism, we're going to end on this, I promise. The most, to me, that's very clear. There's no doubt in my mind. The most unrecognized determinant of human behavior, and it's not projection on my part, is negative reinforcement.
Negative reinforcement. Yeah.
Right. Most of the thing that I do, Bruce, is to decrease my anxiety, shame, or guilt.
Yeah.
I can
at a very holistic sense.
That's
at a very
what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like I'm going to the fridge to decrease the anxiety, right? I'm listening to Beethoven to decrease the anxiety, right? I'm reading a novel to decrease the anxiety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And Skinner was so clear about positive reinforcement work, punishment doesn't work, but negative reinforcement. Oh my God, that's the beast. That's what we should pay attention to, because this is what is essentially preventing us to actualize. Because we make some choice on the immediate consequences of reducing anxiety instead of staying with the challenge, right? Okay. Now, Can you think about a more brilliant way of doing negative reinforcement than internalizing it?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Suppressions, repressions, projections. I mean, there is nothing more of a negative reinforcement than to say, the problem is not me, right? The problems are the Jews, or the problems are, whatever, right? That's a perfect negative reinforcement. Suddenly, oh, the problem is not me. The problems are gay people.
Yeah.
And what happened when you do that? Your anxiety just went. But that's a defense mechanism, right? You cannot touch that from a CBT perspective. You can't touch that from a humanistic perspective. You need to go back to Sigmund.
Louis, we will continue this conversation, maybe not in a podcast, but this is absolutely inspiring for therapists to listen to, in my mind, to get the context, the complexity, the richness, and the importance of what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has
All right.
been great.
Let's continue that over wine.
We will do.
Take care, Bruce.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes this very special episode of the Making Therapy Better podcast with Bruce Wampold. We hope you'll stay tuned for the rest of season 3. We have a lot of exciting guests coming up and can't wait to share that with you every other Wednesday morning on wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, today's podcast was brought to you by CarePath's EHR. Are you a clinical supervisor or do you run a training clinic? CarePaths is a comprehensive electronic health record system built with you in mind. Research shows that therapists get better outcomes and improve more over the course of their careers when they regularly measure their clients' treatment progress and experiences in therapy and then discuss those measures collaboratively. Along with a host of other features, CarePaths makes it easy for therapists to integrate measurement-based care into their practice with just a few clicks. Head over to carepaths.com now to learn more about our EHR system designed with training clinics in mind and join us on the path toward making therapy better. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. We hope to see you next time.